So now in Module 3, we're going to be talking about Helen of Troy. And as we know, Helen of Troy, that's her most well-known epithet because of her going with Paris to Troy and then causing the Trojan War. And so in this module, we're going to be looking at Helen's stay in Troy and particularly her representation in the Iliad. So we've seen how women are delineated within the world of the Homeric epics as possessions, as women having their role being to marry and to give birth, to be silent, to weave in the house. So what do we do with someone like Helen, who, yes, she married Menelaus, she had a daughter, Hermione, right? Problematic from the start because we want sons. But she leaves her husband and child and she goes with a Trojan stranger to the other side of the world and becomes really kind of the example of the anti-woman, what every man is afraid that his woman might do. So what do we do with this representation of Helen, and how does Homer deal with this? Because she's very much a woman who is out of control. So there are obviously these kinds of other myths that we know around Helen, and Helen's story has been told and retold throughout the ages by different authors. We also come to Helen with our own preconceptions, and particularly an English audience will be always thinking of that line, the face that launched 1,000 ships, within our own literary canon, which is obviously Christopher Marlowe. But we need to think about what Homer says and what Homer's Helen is like. And we need to be very aware that this is just one representation of a Helen character within a much larger myth. So for me, the major themes and questions that we need to ask about Helen in Homer is whether Homer sees Helen as to blame for the war. So the question is, did she leave Menelaus voluntarily? Did Paris force her? Or was she a victim of the gods? Right? That's the whole story behind the judgment of Paris. So more broadly then, depending on how we read that, is she a victim or is she a cunning manipulator? Is she getting exactly what she wants, or are the men forcing her to dance a merry dance for them? And why is Helen given so much more airtime in the Iliad than the other women? Is it because Homer is interested in her for some particular reason? Is it because she's the cause of the war, and so Homer is using her to represent that? And can we pin Helen down with one interpretation? Or is it valuable to think about Helen in all of these different ways, perhaps residing between all of these different interpretations, between blame, being forced by the gods, being forced by men, and that perhaps articulates women's position in an interesting way. So we first see Helen in the Iliad in Book 3, and we come upon her weaving, and this is a particularly important scene, not just for the interpretation of Helen, but for the Iliad as a whole. So this is the passage. She was weaving a great cloth, a crimson cloak of double thickness, and she was working in the many trials of the Trojan horsebreakers and bronze-clad Achaeans, trials which for her sake they had suffered under the hands of Ares. So, first time we see Helen, she's weaving, archetypal woman, so she's definitely conforming in that sense. But she's also breaking out, because what she's weaving is a scene of the war. She's weaving the trials of the bronze-clad Achaeans and the Trojan horsebreakers. And this is really important and interesting because that, of course, is the subject of the poem. And so in this moment, Helen, the weaver, is also being connected to Homer, the male poet. And she's telling a story of war. That's not exactly the realm of women, as we've heard Hector tell Andromache. She's also weaving the trials that were done for her sake. So we need to ask, is this the narrator blaming her? Is he saying that she's the problem? Or is this Helen saying, well, this is the problem, that I'm the problem, and I feel bad about this, and the only thing I can do because I'm a woman is weave? So we need to think about that kind of contrast between her being both blamed, perhaps, the war that's happening for her sake, but also submissive as a woman who is engaging with a typical female role in weaving. And she's also been connected to the poet as agent, who's taking control of their own narrative and perhaps spinning it in a certain way. So which of these different characterizations are we meant to believe? We then see her go onto the walls of Troy, and we get a kind of standard male perspective on her. So these are the old men of Troy looking at Helen, and they say, "Small wonder that Trojans and bronze-greaved Greeks have suffered for such a woman. She is so like an immortal goddess. Yet, lovely as she is, let her sail home, not stay to be a bane to us and our children." So note this very typical discourse around Helen, that she's being blamed, but at the same time objectified. Look how beautiful she is, I can gaze on her and objectify her, but she's also to blame for the war. Helen then goes on to name all of the Greek leaders. So King Priam asks her to look over the walls. This is a famous passage known as the Teikoskopia, looking down from the walls. And she names the Greek leaders. And this is an interesting moment because, again, she's given an unusual amount of speech for a woman in the epics. And she really kind of takes agency in naming the different leaders. We then get the duel in Book 3 over Helen between Paris and Menelaus. Of course, Paris is snatched away by Aphrodite, and Helen, being summoned back by Aphrodite, rebukes the goddess, blames her for making her follow Paris, and says that Paris actually isn't as good a husband as Menelaus. She wishes that she had died instead, or was still married to Menelaus. So this is pretty strong. This is Helen pretty strongly stating that it was the gods that were to blame, not herself. But then we get this interesting passage where she then goes to bed with Paris, and there isn't mentioned the fact that Aphrodite is forcing her. In fact, Paris just persuades her and says, "You're really beautiful, I really want to go to bed with you," and Helen just does it. Is this because she's obeying Paris, because she's being a good wife? Is it because Aphrodite is there in the background? Or is it because Helen actually wants to? And we're never told that. And I think that there is a sense here in which Homer is actually deliberately exploiting and exploring that ambiguity. We see her next in Iliad 6, where Hector visits Troy. She asks him to sit down, they have a little chat, and in the meantime she blames herself for the war, and she calls herself a bitch. She uses quite strong language, a she-dog. But people have asked, is she actually really blaming herself here? Is she saying she's to blame for the war? Or is she actually subtly manipulating Hector into feeling sorry for her and using that as a way to get what she wants? In Iliad book 24, we have this same problem where she laments Hector's death. Now Hector's died, and she says that she's being shunned by everyone else. So again, like we saw her at the beginning, she's now very much engaging with the traditional female speech genre here with lament, previously with weaving. But again, she's also trying to elicit a response, sort of, poor me, everyone doesn't like me, they all blame me. You know, Hector was the only one who looked after me. So there's this kind of real double characterization here between Helen being blamed for the war, but also being sympathised with, and also then sort of manipulating, using her speech ability to manipulate men. So the poet Homer is interested in Helen as the cause of the war, but it's precisely because she's the cause of the war that she can become such a good figure for exploring poetry and its mechanisms, which is why we see her, I think, at the beginning in Book 3, weaving that web. Helen as the cause of the war can then be used to reflect on the war more broadly. So what happens after Troy, after the Trojan War has finished, which Helen caused and the conflict is finished, and Helen has to go home and pretend to be a happy wife with Menelaus? And that's the story that we see in the Odyssey, and that's what we'll be exploring in the next module.